Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I would like to thank the organizers for allowing me to speak to you tonight, and I will be as brief as I can. Straight at the beginning, let me clarify that the ideas I will express tonight are strictly my own and do not necessarily, although to a big degree they do, but not necessarily reflect the views either of our Greek Ship Owners Union and more of the European Ships Owner Union, of which I have the great honor of being the chair. Right. Normally, when we speak about the future and trying to predict the future, this is a business for politicians or clairvoyants, these people who predict the stars. It's not an ideal field for engineers or people who are dealing with the shipping business, but I will try in a very brief outline to explain what is today in the minds of the various European but also worldwide shipping bodies, and how do they see some of the things developing in the future. Well, one of the big challenges, and I think this is not new, it is not unknown, it has been spoken about very much, is the everlasting problem of having international versus regional regulations. Going forward, you know very well that there are international regulations, mostly, if not exclusively, decided and regulated by the IMO, but we also have the unpleasant situations of having several regional regulations being also put in place, and this is very unpleasant for shipping. It's an anathema for shipping, because if every region of the world imposes its own regulations, soon enough we will have such difficulty to comply with all these regulations that trade will become impossible. You know many of these very obvious examples. OPA 90 was the first one. The current ballast water management system is another one. The European MRV system is yet another one. The conundrum around the ship recycling issues is another one. And of course, lately of great importance, the issue of how we go forward in dealing with the greenhouse gas emissions. So international versus regional is the first big challenge going forward. Now, in Europe, people think a little bit more globally, if I may say so, in terms of trying to decide or discuss which are the challenges for shipping in the future. And I can tell you, last year the European Commission, the Transport Commissioner, called for a 2 days closed seminar in Florence. There about 20 people were invited. Significantly, very few ship owners, I was lucky to be one of them, but out of the 20, about 10 came from the cluster, Mr. Korkidis, and the rest, were officials from the Commission, somebody from EMSA, and so on. But we had 2 days of very interesting and intense discussion, and I will tell you briefly a few of the points which came out of this general, unofficial, informal, but very substantial and very substantive discussion. Well, the first is obviously the issue of the environment. No need to tell many things about this. This is a very hot issue. It has several aspects. By far, the most urgent today and the most talked about today is the situation of dealing with the CO2 issue, the greenhouse gases, but there are several ancillary issues. You are all very well aware of the 2020 0.5 sulfur regulation. This regulation is going to be initiated on the 1st of January of 2020. There's no going back, but there are issues there to be dealt with between now and the implementation date, issues of availability, issues of safety, issues of stability of the proposed fuels, issues of compliance and enforcement and other things, and we have been trying to make this very clear to the regulators. Another issue is the recycling of ships. Another issue, this ballast water management system. But the most important one, on which there is a lot of work being done now, a lot of politics are at issue, are obviously the efforts to bring through the IMO an international regulation for the emission of CO2. The industry is quite active in this. At least for Europe, the general intention is to push ahead for ambitious targets, but not unrealistic targets, and not targets which start from dreaming or fairy tales. It's the European policy to try to achieve the maximum influence through the ICS and through intervening at the subsequent MEPC's conferences. The next one is coming up very shortly. And there not everyone sees eye to eye, but the hope is that the IMO will be able soon enough to regulate on this matter. Indeed, as I said, an ambitious target sequence between now and, say, 2050 or 2060. And this regulation ought to be welcomed by all countries, including Europe, which is being difficult in the sense as wishing stricter and more ambitious targets. So this also relates to a sub-issue, separate issue, but relating to the same problem, which is the MRV alignment. As you know, there is already an MRV system in Europe in application, but the IMO is coming forward with its own data collection system, and there the European establishment and political system says, we'll give you time until 2023 for IMO to employ an MRV system which we like. Otherwise, by 2023, Europe will reconsider its position and may act unilaterally to bring shipping into a ETS, emissions trading scheme system, something which for shipping is an anathema. The second larger issue going forward is trying to achieve what we call in Europe the single European window, which is facilitating the procedures and the documentation and the systems throughout the entire transport chain, from the shipper through to the ship, through to the port, through to the customs, through to the receiver. Now every country has its own documentation and clearance system. This is a nightmare, and there are already some efforts by the European Commission, the Simplification of Procedures Directive, but this is not enough. We need a much larger and much more comprehensive directive one day, which will unify and streamline all these different procedures, both nationally, i.e. horizontally, but also vertical through the transportation chain. So this is a so-called single European window. The social agenda is also quite important for many countries. Clearly, we have great interest in dealing with the problems of everyone who is a seafarer, but also everyone who is closely connected with the shipping business. I'm sure you all know the recent discussions about unmanned ships. Yes, unmanned ships will come one day, but in a very limited, I believe, application in our lifetime. There are several issues there, safety, security, but above all, there is the concern that by driving away active seamen, not only do we lose our seafarers, but we also lose the people who eventually, after completing their sea service, will become the staff, the important staff of our shipping companies. So this is a concern. The next important concern going forward is digitalization and what will happen with it in the future. And alongside with digitalization comes a concept which is very much in fashion today called disruption. Now, disruption is sort of served as a new idea. I think disruption, you can say, is what we used to call in the past thinking outside the box, but also actually doing something about it. I used to think that this was all rubbish, but I read a few weeks ago that Tom Enders, and the name may be familiar to you, he's the chief executive officer of Airbus for the last 15 or 20 years, a very important and respected man in business. He hired his chief engineer, his chief technological officer, and ordered him to study the entire Airbus construction complex on the basis of disruption. That means go about changing everything, changing the way they think about things, they decide about things, they design things, they build things. So digitalization is also a, let's say, fashionable word, but I am not particularly moved by this issue. You know, digitalization has taken hold in every business ashore. It still lags a little bit behind in the ships, but my own simple technical view is that the reason why it lags behind is because simply until today, the speed of transfer data between ship and shore is very, very much smaller than is the case in every other business. So yes, we're catching up, we will catch up faster, but it's not something that should appear as a new, unknown problem in the shipping industry. It's catching up. Most of us know this already. It's a little bit difficult to grasp for politicians who think it's something that came from the moon, but it's one of the issues that is being discussed. Finally, another important problem, and this is very important for us, Greeks also, is the competitiveness of the shipping fleet, of the European shipping fleet, talking in this particular instance, which, as I say, is one of the main pillars of the way we think forward, what will happen with the European fleet. And this is particularly important for us because, of course, there are many different fleets, many different trades, and many different kinds of businesses in Europe. But these other ones are businesses which in total constitute about 25% of the European shipping, which are short sea shipping, passenger shipping, ro-ros and ferries and so on, but these are not going to go anywhere. For them, competitiveness means cost control and cost reduction. But their business is not going anywhere, and these companies are not going anywhere anyway. The fleet that is at risk of emigrating to other big shipping centers is the long-distance deep-water blue fleet of Europe, the Trump fleet as we know it, i.e. entirely the type of fleet that the Greeks are engaged, which constitutes about 75% of the entire European fleet. This is important because obviously there are other shipping centers in the world which offer very attractive terms, and actually a study was commissioned about a year and a half ago by Deloitte, and this study has been presented to the Commission, both the Commissioner for Transport and the Commissioner for Competition, which basically says that Europe is not in a too bad state, but there are other centers which offer more, and therefore we have to be alert to this and try to match what these other centers are offering so that we retain and, if possibly, grow the percentage of the European fleet as part of the world fleet. You may think that this has only to do with how ships perform economically and financially, but for Europe there is a much larger issue. And the issue is that this fleet has a very great strategic importance for Europe. No one can think of Europe without its long-distance deep-water fleet. And if you see a map of Europe without nothing, it's like a lifeless dead body. But if you see the oceans of the world full of the thousands of European ships, then this is the blood that feeds Europe, and if this blood circulation is cut off, then Europe is destined to die. And surely the worst thing that can happen is that one day Europe, but also the rest of the Western world, the USA, Canada, and others, wake up and find out that their whole trade is performed by ships which are built, operated, managed out of, and manned by Far Eastern nations, namely those nations which are Europe's and the Western world's main trading competitors. And last, and I'm getting close to finish, the situation with what we call the level playing field, on which the Europeans, and especially the European cluster, but not the shore cluster, mostly ports and terminals and other services, are very much concerned, seeing other nations, especially China, coming to Europe and buying ports and terminals, whilst the opposite cannot happen in China at this point in time, and this is causing a great concern here in Europe, because selling important European infrastructure to foreigners, but without being able to invest reciprocally in their territories is not particularly liked. And finally, a couple of fancy challenges. And you know, normally when you go about your business every day in your office, you don't think about these things, but from time to time, you come to read about them, and you wonder what is really meant by these. Maybe some of you have read a few days ago in the papers that Maersk, which is this huge container company, is setting up a strategy group to study what will happen in 30 years, or 10, 15, 30 years from now, because they are terribly worried that what they do as a business is exactly the same thing as Amazon is doing for a business. Except Amazon's packages are, for the moment, quite smaller than Maersk's packages, but the business is the same. They move packages from one area to the other. So they realize what happens if one day Amazon scales up the size of its packages, and then they lose a big part of their business. Another thing I read recently was a Dutch initiative, I believe it was Dutch, which says, well, why should charterers charter a dedicated ship on a dedicated contract and do a dedicated chartering? Let's do what they call the Uber of the seas. So many ships go around, they don't have particular or fixed business, so anyone who has a cargo just calls them and makes a contact on the spot. And you know, we may find these things funny, but believe me, they will come. They will come one day, and you know, we better try to get ready for these. And one last observation, perhaps connecting to the previous panel also, which was about the cluster. Vasily, the cluster in Greece has two things about it. One is positive and one is negative. The positive things is that you are many and you are representing a lot of people, therefore you have a lot of votes, which ship owners don't. The bad thing is that you are based ashore in Greece, and you know that this is not a good thing. You know, this is not a helpful thing. But anyway, make no mistake, I used to think exactly like I heard you speaking before, until 2 years ago when I went to Europe. And there we have a different situation. When these people speak about shipping, they speak about the cluster. They don't speak about ship owning. And I was, you know, deep inside me, I didn't like this. But unfortunately, I came to realize that the cluster is important in its own right. It's important because it attracts a lot of political attention. It attracts even more political attention because it represents businesses which is right at the front of the politicians. They see it in the port, they see it in the quay, they see it in the terminal, whilst they don't see the VL, you know, running around the ocean. So yes, we have to develop the cluster in Greece, but we need an awful lot of work, and we are still very much behind. And let's not kid ourselves comparing the Greek cluster with Holland or England or other places. We still have a lot of way to cover. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. That is all I propose to say. If there are any questions, I will be happy to oblige.
Thank you.